All right, Shabbosai, good morning. Let us begin. I want to begin by thanking our sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Shvat. Yoel Sara Kelman for dedicating all the shiurim and drashos this month in honor of the birth of their daughter Oriya Tahel, and in the hope that all the couples davening for children will soon have their tefilos answered b'karov. To thank Teri Czinn for dedicating all the shiurim and drashos this month in honor of their grandchildren Adin, Tzvi, and Naftali, Moshe, and to thank Shirley Elbaum Family for dedicating the shiurim this month in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Shirley's husband, Gerald Elbaum, Yaakov Kopel, R Avraham Menachem. We thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Paul and Kathy Pollack, for dedicating the Week of Learning in memory of Paul's sister, Leah Bas Shmuel, on the occasion of her yahrzeit on the 11th of Teves. We also thank our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Zevi Shoshy Daniel Iilui, nishmas, Yitzchok Yisroel ben Refoel Noach Yosef, whose yahrzeit was on zayin Teves. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the nishmas will have an aliyah and the families in a chama. Well, with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Daf Lamed. We are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Chof Tes Amud Beis 29b. We left off yesterday in our share here in Shul, second wide line. Amarav. Actually, we left off a little bit later on, but let's go ahead. Actually, I think we left off a lot later on. Let's pick up. Let's pick up there. Second wide line. Amarav. Second wide line, 29b Amarav. Again, a little chazara, but that's pretty much around the area where we left off. So Amarav, Rav says as follows. Lo shanu elo lefanav, aval achrav motus. So we'll say now an interesting machlokes. Remember again, we pointed this out in yesterday's shir, and the truth is we mentioned this already when we began the Mishnah. What's fascinating to recognize in this discussion regarding the prohibitions associated with 9 days is, if you notice again, as much as the Mishnah said, Mishenichnas av mema'atin b'simcha, which we'll get to today in Meretz Hashem, about what exactly that means. We diminish our simcha once the month of Av comes. The mourning practices associated with Tisha B'Av are Shavuot Shechalbo, are the week of Tisha B'Av itself. The week of Tisha B'Av itself. Now the Gemara records an interesting machlokes. So we'll say, when we say the week of Tisha B'Av, does that include just the days before Tisha B'Av? Or does it potentially even include what? The days after Tisha B'Av as well. So Amarav lo shon el lefanov aval achrav muter. Rav says that the mourning practices only apply in the days leading up to Tisha B'Av, but certainly do not apply after Tisha B'Av. After Tisha B'Av, there are no mourning practices. So Shmuel says, afilu achrav nami asr. Shmuel says, no. When we say Shavuot Shechalbo, this is really fascinating. When we say that there are mourning practices the week of Tisha B'Av, that literally means what? Afterwards also. In other words, the entire week of Tisha B'Av, including after Tisha B'Av. So Meisvei, the Gemara is the Kasha, Shabbos Shechal Tisha B'Av Lios B'Socha, the week in which Tisha B'Av falls out, Asr L'Saper U'Lechabes, you can't take a haircut, you can't launder, U'B'Chamishi Mutarin Mipnei Kavod HaShabbos. But on Thursday it's permitted, Alts Kavod Shabbos. Says the Gemara, what's the case? In other words, when is Tisha B'Av falling out in this particular scenario? Keitzad, Chalios be'echad b'Shabbos. If Tisha B'Av fell out on Sunday, Mutar l'Chabes kala Shabbos kula. Ultimately, again, then also what that means is Tisha B'Av is on Sunday. You're allowed to go ahead and launder and take a haircut the rest of the week. B'Sheni, B'Shlishi, B'Revi, B'Chamishi. If Tisha B'Av falls out on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, L'fanav Aser, you can't launder or take a haircut before Tisha B'Av, but la'acharav mutar. But after Tisha B'Av is mutar. Chalios be'erev Shabbos, if Tisha B'Av falls out on a Friday, which I will say for us now is a calendrical impossibility, but before the calendar was set, that was possible. Mutar l'chabes, b'chamishi mipnei kavod HaShabbos. You can go ahead and launder on Thursday because of Kavod Shabbos. Listen to this. If you did not launder your clothing on Thursday, mutar l'chabes be'erev Shabbos minha mincha ulamala. Interestingly enough, I will say, if Tisha B'Av fell out on a Friday, ideally we want you to launder your clothing when? On Thursday. But if you did not do it on Thursday, what can you do? from Friday. Now, what's Friday in this case? What's Friday? Friday's Tisha B'Av. You could do it on Friday on Tisha B'Av from mincha time and on. Mina mincha ulamayla. Abaye and others said they were not happy with this practice. They did not want people laundering or doing anything on actual Tisha B'Av itself, even from mincha time and on. But I will just point out, it's not our topic now, but the Beis Yosef actually quotes the practice on even just a stam year of people beginning to go ahead and launder clothing on a regular year, on Tisha B'Av, after mincha time. Now he rejects it halacha l'maisa, but he quotes that practice was in effect. In any event, chalios b'shen b'chamishi. So I will say, now again we're transitioning just to another quick topic. So just keep in mind, there's a fundamental machlokes raging over here. Machlokes Rav and Shmuel. What's that machlokes? Do the restrictions of Shavua Shechalbo apply after Tisha B'Av or not? Rav says no. Rav says Shavuot Shechalbo is only before Tisha B'Av, not after Tisha B'Av. Shmuel says no, even after Tisha B'Av. So we're quoting now a whole brisa. Let's continue with the brisa. Chalios b'sheni b'chamishi. If Tisha B'Av falls out on a Tuesday, on a Monday or a Thursday, Korin Shoshum after Echad, you have 3 aliyahs and 1 haftorah, right? One, and the third one is maftir. Ub'shlishi b'revi, but however, if Tisha B'Av falls out on a Tuesday or Wednesday, Kore Echad umaftir Echad. There's 1 aliyah and a maftir. Rabbi Yossi says no. Li'olam Korin Shlosho maftir Echad. You always read 3 aliyos, and the last aliyah is maftir, which is how we paskin. But Rabbi say, what do you see from here? Again, what are we focusing on? What do you see from this brisa? You see from this brisa that when do the prohibitions of Shavua Shechalbo apply until? What does the brisa say? Until when? Until Tisha B'Av and not afterwards. Therefore, tiyufta de Shmuel. This is an effective refutation of the position of Shmuel, telling us that halacha l'maisa, the prohibitions of Shavua Shechalbo of the week of Tisha B'Av only apply up until Tisha B'Av and not past it. Amr lecha Shmuel will defend his position. He will say, Tanaihi, it's a machlokes Tanaim. It's a machlokes Tanaim. The Sanya, Tisha B'Av, Shechalios b'Shabbos. I just have to stop for just a second. I just want to show you something beautiful. See, 2 tables over here. Bachar Bar Mitzvah, Yehuda Rosenblum. Right, 2 tables behind him, Jeremy Lassen. Right, Baruch Shem Bar Mitzvah, just had a baby. Here's the beauty of Daf. It doesn't stop. You could have a baby, you could have a bar mitzvah, you could have this, whatever it is, whatever is going on. The beauty in Daf is it continues all of the time. And by the way, this is a good opportunity to text those people who are not here and just maybe just share that snippet with them. Right? It does not football. It doesn't stop for nothing. It doesn't stop for anything. It doesn't stop. And part, by the way, of what it doesn't stop is also not just the learning, but whenever possible, to be here for share. To be able to share, that's part of the godless of it, is the regilos, is the continuity of it. Whatever is happening in your life, you make sure that whatever, see, it's not the pshat that you fit the daf in. It's the pshat that you fit everything else in your life into the daf. That's the way it works. And when you take that mindset, everything else has to fit into the daf. Okay, incredible. Anyway, back to the Gemara. Gemara says as follows. So Shmuel will defend his position. He will say it's a machlokes tanoim. So the Gemara says this sanya Tisha B'Av shechalios b'Shabbos. When Tisha B'Av falls out on Shabbos, v'chein erev Tisha B'Av shechalios b'Shabbos, or erev Tisha B'Av falls out on Shabbos, what's the halacha? Ochal b'shosek kol tzarcho. Uma'ala al shulchana afilu kisudas shlomo b'shaito. So we'll say a very beautiful Gemara. Very beautiful. And this is indeed, it's halacha l'maisa. We're going to talk about some of the restrictions concerning the Suda Mafsekes, the final meal before Tisha B'Av. But interestingly enough, when Erev Tisha B'Av, now, choose both say, it's the same halacha if Erev Tisha B'Av falls out on Shabbos or if Tisha B'Av falls out on Shabbos, because the effective reality is the same, which is what? Tisha B'Av is observed on Sunday. Now again, it could be real Tisha B'Av on Sunday or what we call a nidche, a delayed Tisha B'Av on Sunday. But either way, when you are having your Suda HaMafsekes on Shabbos, there are no restrictions on that meal. And in fact, the Mishnah said, the Gemara says, Ma'ala ashulchano afilu kisudas shlomo b'shaito. You could even have a Suda like Shlomo HaMelech in the height of his monarchy. You want to have a meal of Solomonic proportions, right? You are permitted to do so. Meat, wine, remember again, that's in that's contradistinction to what we're going to learn about regular Suda Mafsekes. Regular Suda Mafsekes is a very tightly controllable site. Not to be confused, people often get confused between the Suda Mafsekes of Erev Tisha B'Av and of Yom Kippur, right? The Suda Mafsekes of Erev Yom Kippur is a celebratory meal. The Suda Mafsekes prior to Tisha B'Av is a very austere, mournful meal, with one exception. If Erev Tisha B'Av is on Shabbos, there are no restrictions as to what you could have for that particular Su'udah. V'asr l'saper, again, we'll get into this. V'asr l'saper, u'lechabes merosh chodesh, v'ad hatainis of Rebbe Meir. And you cannot go ahead and launder your clothing or take a haircut from Rosh Chodesh up until the Taanis. So now for the first time, we see an opinion who backs up the restrictions to Rosh Chodesh Av. To Rosh Chodesh Av. Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Kol HaChodesh Kula Aser. Rabbi Yehuda actually says, this is incredible. All of Av is prohibited from laundering and from hair cutting. Rabbi Shimon Leal Omer, Shimon Leal says, Inu Aser Ela Osa Shabbos Bilvad. Rabbi Shimon Leal says only that particular week, right? Shavuot Shechalbo is going to be Aser. V'Tanya Idach, another brisa says, V'Noeg Evel Merosh Chodesh V'Ad Taanis. Another brisa says we conduct ourselves with morning practices from Rosh Chodesh up until the fast. Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Kol HaChodesh Kulo. Rabbi Yehuda says the entire month. Rabbi say, now where does Rabbi Yehuda get that the entire month? Where does he get that the entire month is legislated or is restricted by these morning practices? What did the Mishnah say? What did the Mishnah say? Misha nichnas av mematin b'simcha. From the lashon of the Mishnah, it would seem that the entire month of Av has these restrictions. Rabbi Shimon Leal Omer, Eino aser elosh osa Shabbos bilvad. Rabbi Shimon Leal says only that week. Now, both said what's interesting over here is what Shmuel's understanding is. But Rabbi Shimon Leal says that week. What does that week include? Potentially include the entire week, even the days after the fast. So ultimately, again, Shmuel's just saying there's a machlokes. And I happen to hold like one of the opinions holds that the restrictions of Shavuot Shechalbo are in fact until when? Until after the fast as well. I'm Rabbi Yochanan. Ushloshtan mikra echad darshu. So Rabbi Yochanan says, by the way, all three of these opinions, darshan the same pasuk, the chsiv, because the pasuk says, Vishbasi kol masosa, but quoting over here from Hosea, Vishbati kol masosa, which literally means, I will bring to an end all of its celebrations, Chaga, Chodsha, Vishabasa. Chaga means it's Chag, it's Yom Tiv. Chodsha, it's month. Shabasa, it's week. So watch this, Rabbi. So here we go. So the opinion that says the morning practices are in effect from Rosh Chodesh up until the Taanis, he darshans the word what? Chaga. Because the pasuk says, I will bring to an end your Chaga. They will say Chaga means Rosh Chodesh according to this opinion. Alright, ultimately again he'll dash in Chodesh. So interestingly enough, everyone's darshaning the same pasuk, ultimately again to give them their particular durations of the restrictions. Incredible. Amar Rava says, Halacha Reb Shimon Gamliel. So Rava said the halacha follows Reb Shimon Gamliel. That halacha lamaisa, the prohibition is only that particular week. Va'amar Rava says, halacha Rabbi Meir. The halacha was Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir holds that what? Rabbi Meir holds that halacha lamaisa. Rabbi Meir says that the restrictions are from Rosh Chodesh up until the Taanis. So what's going on over here? So Rava is saying that the halacha was Rabbi Meir from Rosh Chodesh up until the fast, and the halacha was Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Shavuot Shechalbo, week of. So what does that mean? To which the Gemara says, "V'tarvayhu lekula." He's applying both of them ultimately again in a lenient fashion. How so? So we'll say, watch this. Now both say the Gemara says, well, let's see. Because if he would have said the halacha follows Rabbi Meir, I would have thought that what? Hava amina afilu merosh chodesh. You might have thought that the restrictions apply even from Rosh Chodesh. Kamash malan halacha Reb Shimon Gamliel. Therefore, he says halacha follows Reb Shimon Gamliel. What does Reb Shimon Gamliel say? The restrictions only apply when? week of. But if it would have said namely that the restrictions apply week of, hava aminu afilu la'acharov. I would have thought week of means what? Means what? Even after the fast. Kamash malon halach Rabbi Meir. Therefore, he says halach Rabbi Meir. So we'll say this is really very interesting. So what Rava seems to say is as follows: Rava adopts two positions to ultimately create a leniency. He says the halacha follows Rabbi Meir, but Rabbi Meir holds that the restrictions apply from Rosh Chodesh up until when? Up until the fast. And then he says the halacha follows Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, who says that the restrictions apply the week of the fast. Essentially, what Rava is saying is a combination of the two opinions. You see, what we glean from Rabbi Meir is what? That the restrictions, let's work backwards. What we glean from Shimon Gamliel is that the restrictions only apply when? Shavua Shechalba, week of. But from the position of Shimon Gamliel, one could also infer, like Shmuel does, that week of means what? Week of means what? Even after Tisha B'Av as well. Therefore, he says the halacha follows Rabbi Meir, because although Rabbi Meir starts the restrictions as of when? Rosh Chodesh, he ends them when? At the fast day itself. So Rava essentially says the halacha follows both of these opinions. But the conclusion is, what does it mean, both of the opinions? The restrictions only apply when? The week of Tisha B'Av. And when do the restrictions end? When do they end? At Tisha B'Av itself. Now the truth is, we know they actually don't really end at Tisha B'Av. They actually end when? When? Chatzos of the 10th of Av. Because that's what we saw before, again, that halacha l'maisa, the Beis HaMikdash was only set ablaze late in the day of the 9th, burning into the 10th. But halacha l'maisa, that's how I paskin. So I will say, what I will point out, I mentioned this to you before, this is really the position the Shulchan Aruch takes. Right, the Shulchan Aruch, when he speaks about the prohibitions associated, he says, Shavua Shechal Bo Tisha B'Av, this is in Siman Taf Kuf Nun Aleph Sif Gimel. Shavua Shechal Bo Tisha B'Av, Asurim L'Saper U'Lechabes. So the Mechaber says, and I will say, this is how Sfard and Baskin, that there are no 9 days. There are no 9 days. Right, what are there? What is there? Shavua Shechal Bo. Right, the week of Tisha B'Av, you have these restrictions, right? The restrictions ultimately of grooming, of laundering, of meat, of wine. Ashkenazim, the Ramah points out that he says, Va'anu noagin lahachmir b'chol zeh mitchilas rosh chodesh ad achar hatainis. Ultimately, again, so I just want to point out, here, it's fascinating to see when you learn this sugya, really you begin to see that from the Gemara's perspective, the restrictions of Tisha B'Av are really limited to Shavua Shechal Bo. Now, the first time we see something different is when we see when we see Rabbi Meir, who backs up the restrictions ultimately again to Rosh Chodesh. But this is Machlokes, Sfardim and Ashkenazim. Mechaber, Paskins, the restrictions only apply Shavua Shechal Bo. Ashkenazim, our minhag is to back up the restrictions ultimately until Rosh Chodesh Av. Again, more to say about that, we'll come back to that in just a little bit. So we'll say, let's go back there. Erev Tisha B'Av lo yochal adam beis tavshilin. On Erev Tisha B'Av, a person should not go ahead and eat 2 cooked foods. So we'll say part of the morning for Tisha B'Av is that we limit the type of foods we eat on Erev Tisha B'Av. A person shouldn't eat 2 cooked dishes. Says the Gemara, Amrav Yehuda, lo shanu ela mishesh sha'os u'lamayla. This only applies in a meal that you're eating from chatzos, from 6 hours and on. Aval mishesh sha'os u'lamata mutter. In other words, I will say, when do we say that you shouldn't eat 2 cooked foods? That's only any meal you're eating from midday and on Erev Tisha B'Av. But anything you're eating before midday, no restrictions. No restrictions. Furthermore, Rabbi Yehuda says, also this restriction really only applies to what? Your Suda Hamafsekes, the meal you're eating right before the fast. But ultimately, again, if it's not a Suda Hamafsekes, mutter, you could even eat 2 cooked foods. The Gemara says, V'tarbayu l'kula. Now the truth is we take both of these opinions and we emerge with a lenient conclusion. How so? Tzvicha, here we go. Because if we would have just said you can't eat 2 cooked foods in your Suda Mafsakes, you might have thought that that's true even if you're eating your Suda Mafsakes in the morning. As well, let's say I decide I'm eating my Suda Mafsakes at 10 a.m. on Erev Tisha B'Av. You might have thought that therefore, Allah Lamaisa, you can't eat 2 cooked foods during that meal. Kamash malon, mishisha os ulamayla. Therefore, again, the Gemara says, no, the restriction on 2 cooked foods only applies when you're eating your Suda Mafsakes, when? From 6 hours and on. But if you're eating a meal earlier in the day, there is no restriction. And if it would have just said, you can't eat two cooked foods from 6 hours and on, you might have thought that this is even true in a meal that is not your Suda Mafsakes. Kamash malon bisuda mafsikba. Therefore, the Gemara says it only applies to the Suda, your Suda Mafsakes. So therefore, both say, what comes out of here is as follows. That Allah Lamaisa, the restriction on consuming 2 cooked foods as part of a meal is only when? In your Suda Mafsakes, that's being consumed when? After 6 hours into the day. But any meal that does not fit those 2 criteria is not governed by the 2 cooked food restriction. Incredible. Tanya Kalishna Kama, Tanya Kalishna Basra. So we'll say we have 2 different brises. Listen to this. Tanya Kalishna Basra, we have a brisa that supports the second lashon. Hasoed Erev Tisha B'Av, if a person is having Suda on Erev Tisha B'Av, Im Asid Lisod Suda Achares, if you're going to have another meal in the day, Mutar Le'achol Basar V'lishtos Yayin. You could even eat meat and drink wine. Ve'im Lav, but if you're not going to have another meal in the day, therefore this meal is my Suda Mafsakes, Aser le'echol basar v'lishtos yayin. You can't eat meat and drink wine. So Rabbi will say, again, now we're not eating meat or drinking wine on Erev Tisha B'Av at all. But the point the Gemara is making over here is that the meal restrictions only apply to that meal that is going to be your Suda Mafsakis, to that meal which is going to be your final meal before the fast. Tanya Kalishna Kama, another brayso, Erev Tisha B'Av, Lo Yochal Adam Shnei Tavshilin, a person should not eat 2 cooked foods on Erev Tisha B'Av, V'lo Yochal Basar, V'lo Yishte Yayin, and a person should not eat meat and not drink wine. Rabbi Shmuel says, Yishana. Rabbi Shmuel says, we're not so focused on what you can't eat, what you can eat, but rather, here's what we know, is your Suda Mafsakes should be different than your typical meal. Rabbi Yehuda says, Ketza Mishana. Shabbos Rabbi Yehuda says, what's an example? How should you change your meal? Listen to this. If you normally eat 2 cooked foods, then what? Only eat 1. If you normally dine with 10 people, don't dine with 10 people, dine with 5 people. If you normally drink 10 cups of wine, there's much to be said about that. Right? The Gemara says, only drink 5. Only drink 5. That particular meal. When is that so? Mishisha sha'os ulamayla. Only with a meal that you're eating from chatzos and on Erev Tisha B'Av. But again, any meal that's being consumed before 6 hours, mutter. Ultimately, again, there are no restrictions. So what you begin to see is, again, when we speak about restrictions of a Suda HaMafsakes, that requires the Suda to conform to 2 criteria. Criteria number one is what we'll call a timing criteria. It has to be after 6 hours. And number 2, it has to be your final meal before the fast. Any meal that does not conform to those 2 criteria is not going to be regulated by these restrictions. So the Gemara says, Tanya Idach, another brayso says, Erev Tisha B'Av lo yochal adam shnei tavshilin. Right? Erev Tisha B'Av, a person should not go ahead and eat 2 cooked foods. Lo yochal basar v'lo yishte yayin, should not eat meat, should not drink wine. Divrei Rabbi Meir. V'cham say, yishana umemait bebasar b'yayin. The Chum say you should deviate, change from how you normally have your meal, and you should diminish the amount of meat and the amount of wine you consume. Keitzad memait, how do you diminish? If you normally eat a litra of meat, only eat a half a litra. Hayaragya lishtos lug yayin, you normally drink a lug of wine. Yishteh chatzi lug, drink a half a lug. Vim eno ragil kol ikar aser. And if you normally never eat meat, and you normally never drink wine, you certainly can't introduce that into the diet of your sudas on Erev Tisha B'Av. Shmuel says, "Im hayaragya le'achol tznon." I will say first wide line. Im hayaragya le'achol tznon o maliach acher seuda. So, if you normally eat a radish, maliach rabosai means like salted meat after your, or salted fish. It could also mean anything salted after your meal. Harushus biyado. In other words, rabosai, people would often eat something salty after the meal, I guess, to aid in digestion. If you normally eat that, if that's part of your normal practice, you could do that even as part of Yisuda HaMafsakas. Tanya idach, another brayso, koshu mishum Tisha B'Av, asr lechal basar, va'asr lishtos yayin, va'asr lirchotz. So Rabbi said, listen to this. Any meal that you are eating because of Tisha B'Av. Now, Rabbi say, what does that mean, any meal you're eating because of Tisha B'Av? Any meal that is your Suda Mafsekas, right? So any meal that is your final meal before the fast is going to be regulated. How is it going to be regulated? You can't eat meat, you can't drink wine, and you can't wash. It doesn't mean wash your hands like for bread. What it means is that it's going to be an Isser Rechitza, a general prohibition to wash yourself once you begin to consume that meal. Kol she'enu mishum Tisha B'Av, but ultimately, again, any meal that's not because of Tisha B'Av. For example, any other, well, Rashi says over here, Kol she'enu mishum Tisha B'Av kigon, suda mafsik ba betainis tzibor, inami, suda she'enu mafsik ba. What's that? Just go pasha pshat. Any other meal you're eating on Erev Tisha B'Av, that's not your suda mafsekas. Mutar lechol basar v'lishtos yayin. You could eat meat, you could drink wine, basar lirchotz, but you'll still be prohibited to wash yourself. Ultimately, again on Erev Tisha B'Av. Rav Shabbat Yossi Mishum Aviv Kol Shosh Mutar lechol basar Mutar lirchotz. So Rabbi Yossi says, in the name of his father, anytime you're permitted to eat meat, you're also permitted to bathe, permitted to wash. Tan Rabbanan. So we'll say, let's handle this. So we'll say, so I just want to point out, it's just very fascinating to see that halacha l'maisa, you see, for us, especially Ashkenazim, it's so ingrained that comes Rosh Chodesh Av, there's a wholesale prohibition on meat and wine. Right? I just want to point out how fascinating it is. You're seeing the sugyas. These are the sugyas now. And you begin to see, as just aside from one opinion of Rabbi Meir, who holds that the prohibitions apply from Rosh Chodesh, ultimately until the fast, you begin to see at most it's Shavuot Shechalbo, and you even see opinions that are entertaining the possibility of meat and wine consumption, even on Erev Tisha B'Av itself, up until the actual Suda Mafsekes. So it's just fascinating. The reason why this is important is because, sometimes people, especially those who may be lactose intolerant or again may have other diet issues, there's definitely room in halacha to be able to be mekel for not as much wine. I don't know anybody who needs wine, right? So, but certainly again, for meat consumption, certainly for chicken consumption, there are definitely kulas that could be relied upon. You see again, so let's go right there. Says the Gemara. Turn about another fascinating brisa. Kol mitzvos hanagos be'evel, nogos b'tes b'av. The general halacha is as follows: any halacha that applies to avelos, general mourning, applies by Tisha B'Av. How so? Asr ba'achilu b'shtiya. Now we'll say those don't apply by avelos, right? Remember, the fact that I can't eat and I can't drink, that has nothing to do with avelos. What does that have to do with? That's a tiny sibor. Right? So I can't eat, I can't drink. B'sicha, but I will say here the rest of the things that apply by avelos. Sicha, which means anointing oneself with lotions, putting on lotions. You can't put on any lotions on Tisha B'Av. Nilas a sandal, you can't wear leather shoes. Tashmish amita, you can't engage in marital relations. Va'asr likros, batorah, u'benevim ksuvim. You can't learn Tanakh, the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Medrash, Ba'alachos, or Ba'agados. You can't learn Torah. You can't learn Torah on Tisha B'Av, just like an Avel is not permitted to learn Torah. Aval kori hu b'makom she'ino ragal likros. They both said this is incredible. Here the Brisa says, but you could learn something you're not normally accustomed to learning. Now, we'll say, now, what does that mean? Kore b'makom she'eino ragel l'kros, v'shona b'makom she'eino ragel l'shnos. So we'll say, you could read in Tanakh something you're not normally accustomed to reading, and you could learn in Mishnayos or Gemara something you're not normally accustomed to learning. What's the pshat? We'll say, look at Rashi, this is incredible. B'makom she'eino ragel l'kros, Rashi says, T'chevan de lo yada islay tsara. Because Rashi says, listen to this, because when you learn something that you cannot comprehend, that gives you tsar. Isn't that incredible? What I was saying? That when I learn something and I can't chap it, I can't say, I have to understand something. Yeah, you do understand, like the days in which we are living. Think about this just a moment. There is nothing in Torah that is not accessible and not comprehensible. Right? Think about this. Thanks to ArtScroll, thanks to Safaria, thanks to Google, right? Thanks to everything we have, there's pretty much even the most complex, topics. There is nothing that is inaccessible to us today. But what Rashi is referring to over here is the following: that it used to be there were sugyas that were incredibly complex. So the Gemara says that in Avelos and on Tisha B'Av you could learn something that you don't normally learn. Why? Because when you try to learn something and you can't understand it, there's a tsar in that. There's a pain in that. So because there's a tsar, therefore it is permitted ultimately again on Tisha B'Av and during Avelos. Isn't that incredible? Isn't that incredible? And I will say, but here's the real shaila. When we learn something and we don't fully understand it, do we feel the tsar? Do we feel the tsar? And do we plug away at it? Or do we just simply move on? Both say, one of the dangers of the daf, I'm a pretty big fan of the daf, but one of the dangers is that sometimes we get to something, we don't understand it, and we're like, okay, right? And we just, and we kind of just move on. I will say, but it's so important, as fast as we move, if there's something we don't chap, something you don't chap, maybe I didn't explain it correctly, it's so important to understand things to the best of our ability. There are some things that are more complex, and yes, the daf sometimes requires us to be content with a little bit of a more superficial understanding of certain things, but to never chas v'shalom allow ourselves to not understand something, because not understanding a piece of Torah should cause us tsar. If I can't understand it, it should cause tsar. And if it doesn't cause me tsar, I have to work on feeling tsar. I have to work on feeling the pain of not understanding something in Torah. The Gemara goes weiter. So the Gemara says, "V'kori bekinos be'iov ubedvarim haram shebeYirmiyah." So ultimately, again, the Gemara says, but you can read kinos, you can read the story of Eov, you can read the difficult rebuke in Yirmiyah Hanavi, and Yirmiyah Hanavi rebukes us for not following the ways of Torah. V'tinokos shal beis rabban betelin. And about say we close the yeshivas and the chadarim, right? We don't want the children learning Torah. Children don't learn Torah on Tisha B'Av. Mishum shenemar pekudei Hashem yesharim misamche leiv. Ultimately, again, because I will say, pekudei Hashem yesharim, literally the statutes of God are upright. They make the heart happy. When children learn Torah, they're happy. And when parents see their children learning Torah, the parents are happy. So essentially, again, on Tisha B'Av, much like Avelos, we have to curtail our experience of simcha, and one of the ways in which we do that is we don't learn. As difficult as that is, we don't learn. So Rabbi Yehuda says, Af eno kari b'makom she'eino ragel l'kros, ve'eno shona b'makom she'eino ragel l'shnos. So Rabbi Yehuda both say doesn't like this idea. He says, no. You can't learn Torah at all. Even in topics that you're not normally accustomed to learning. Because he says, even if I don't understand something, there will still be a joy in learning it. And therefore Rabbi Yehuda says, you can't learn Torah at all, except for some very specific things. Eov, kinos, with dvarim haram shebeYirmiyah. V'tinoko shel beis rabban betelin, mishum shenemar pekudei Hashem yesharim misamche leiv. We'll say, very, very dramatic. Very dramatic. Tells you about, we'll say, if you think about this, the notion of telling a Jew not to learn Torah. Like telling a Jew not to learn Torah, ultimately is like telling a person not to breathe. So you begin to see how important it is to feel the loss of the Beis Hamikdash, that Chazal wanted us to experience that loss, Chazal wanted us to feel that loss, and they did not want us to distract ourselves with other things, even with Torah. We'll see why it's so important to kind of put everything else on the side and be able just to be one with the loss of the Beis Hamikdash. So the Gemara goes weiter. Lo yochal basar v'lo yishte yayin. Tana, ochel hu basar maliach, v'shose yayin migito. I will say this is very interesting. So remember again, the Mishnah said that on Erev Tisha B'Av, you're not allowed to eat meat, you're not allowed to drink wine. Now the Brisa gives an exception to this. You can eat what's called basar maliach. Basar maliach means salted meat. Salted meat. So the Gemara says, "V'shos yayin migito," or you could drink wine right off the wine press. Salted meat was considered to be inferior meat. To a certain degree, it didn't even have like an identity of meat, heavily salted meat. Similarly, again, wine off the wine press, it didn't even have a chance to really fully ferment, or fully ferment. Say if it was a compromised wine. So if you wanted to eat heavily salted meat, or wine off the wine press, that's fine, because it doesn't really have the identity of meat or identity of wine. So Gemara says, "Basar maliach ad kama." How long is meat sitting in salt? Ultimately, again, to be salt and meat. Amar Avchina bar Kana Moshe Shmuel kol zman kisheno kishlamim. Shabbos say the Gemara compares to a korban shlamim. Korban shlamim had the ability to go ahead and be eaten for 2 days and 1 night. So pretty much, if meat was in salt for more than 2 days and 1 night, that's called salted meat. So that type of meat was already considered to be a more inferior quality meat, and therefore, again, one could technically consume it. V'yayin migito ad kama kozman shu toses. Literally, if it's still fermenting. If the wine is still fermenting, right? Toses literally means like frothing. If it's still fermenting, that's inferior, you could technically drink. In Tana, yayin toses, ein ba mishum gilui. But it's very interesting. There's a concept of mashkin megulin, which is you're not allowed to leave liquids uncovered overnight. And if you leave it uncovered overnight, you're not allowed to drink it. Why? What are we concerned about? What are we concerned about? Snake venom. We're concerned that a snake would come, inject its venom into it, and therefore you could chas shalom be sakana. We'll say, it's interesting. Ar Shulchan says, today, we're not really makbid on this, right? Most people are not really makbid on mashkin megulin, right? If you go ahead and you leave out a cup of water overnight, people will often drink it the next day. Ar Shulchan says it's very simple. Why? Because we don't live in places of snakes, right? Or venomous snakes. So the concern is not really there, which again happens to be a fascinating idea, because I will say, you could say that about so many dinim, right? That halacha, so Shmuel reminded me, this is, we're going to do on December 25th, we're going to do Mirz Hashem, a little bit of, what do they call it? Not a lunch and learn, a breakfast and, what do we call it? Yeah, whatever. Good. We're going to learn. We're going to learn in the morning. After you open your presents. Right? We'll go ahead. We're going to learn. We're going to learn. Amir Hashem. We'll go ahead and we're going to have a nice breakfast, and we're going to actually deal with this topic of Dinei D'Rabbanan, because this has actually come up a lot in our sugis about when do we say the reason no longer applies and therefore the halacha doesn't apply, and when do we say even though the reason no longer applies, the halacha does apply. So Amir Hashem, coming attractions, December 25th, after the Daf Yomi Hashem. So the Gemara goes weiter. So the Gemara says, listen to this. So fermenting wine is not even subject to mashkin megulin. Why not? Listen to this. Rashi says, because snakes won't touch it. Right? Why won't snakes touch it? Interesting. Rashi says, because they're afraid. Look at Rashi, last Rashi in the Daf. Sheinacha shoseu ki yivrach merisichaso. Apparently when wine is fermenting, like it makes like a sound, like the fermentation process, the foaming process. So the snake apparently gets scared from the foaming, from the sound of the foaming, and therefore again the snake won't really inject any venom into it. Fascinating. So the Gemara says, "V'kama tisisaso," and how long does it take wine to really ferment? Gimel yamim, 3 days. 3 days. I'm supposed to listen to this. Kach hayom min hago sh'Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Iilui. I will say this was the minhag of Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Iilui. Erev Tisha B'Av. This is how we had it through the Mafsekes. Erev Tisha B'Av, mevi'in lo pas chareva b'melach. So I will say the Gemara now here is describing the Seuda HaMafsekes of Rabbi Yehuda Bar Iilui. Here's how he had it through the Mafsekes. They would bring him pas chareva. And I will say pas chareva means just unflavored bread. Unflavored bread. B'melach, you would have it with salt. V'yoshev amud beis. V'yoshev ben tanur l'kirayim. He would sit between the stove and the wall, which was an area of incredible soot, right? Va'ochel v'shos alei kiton shamayim, and he would go ahead and he would drink a little bit, a flask of water. V'dome kemi shemeso muta lefanov, and ultimately, again, when you looked at him, you looked like someone who had just lost a loved one. I will say this is how he had the Suda Mafsekis. Also, I will tell you, in our mishpacha, this is how we have the Suda Mafsekis as well, not between the oven, but on the floor, with bread, with salt, and with water. That's the Suda Mafsekis before Tisha B'Av. I will say this was the Suda HaMafsekis. Now again, to be clear, he was eating, the way the Suda Mafsekis works is you eat a regular meal earlier on. As you have a meal, whatever you're having for your meal, you have for your Suda Mafsekis. But the last thing a person eats before Tisha B'Av is the bread, salt, water on the floor, ultimately again preparing one's self for the onset of Tisha B'Av. Tanan Hassam, we learn, because this is, you'll see something from Tanan Hassam. Makom shinagu lasos malacha b'tes b'av. So we're going to come back to this in just a moment. Makom shinagu lasos malacha b'tes b'av osin. So we'll say, this is another fascinating halacha. Malacha on Tisha B'Av. Are you allowed to work on Tisha B'Av? So that where there is the minhag to do malacha on Tisha B'Av, you can do malacha. Makom shinagu shalom asos ein osin. Ultimately, again, if where there is the minhag not to do malacha, we don't do malacha on Tisha B'Av. U'b'chol makom talmidei chachamim b'teilim. But I will say, in any place, talmidei chachamim should not do malacha on Tisha B'Av. I will say, Tisha B'Av is a day to mourn what we have lost. I will say, watch this. Omer, li'olam ya'aseh kol adam atzmo ki talmid chacham. A person should make themselves like a talmid chacham and don't work on Tisha B'Av. Don't work on Tisha B'Av. Tanya nami hachir shivim li'omer li'olam ya'aseh adam atzmo ki talmid chacham kedei sheyis'aneh. A person ultimately, again, should make himself go like a Talmud Chacham. In other words, there's no mechzik, there's no arrogance in that. If at all possible, a person should not work on Tisha B'Av. We'll say it's just so incredibly important. If a person has control over their schedule, Tisha B'Av is not a day to work. It's not a day to work. It's a day to take the time and to mourn that which we have lost. Remember, Tisha B'Av is the day. Now, we'll say it's interesting when Yom HaShoah was first instituted, there was an incredible amount of backlash about instituting a new day for Holocaust remembrance, because at the end of the day, we have a day when we remember every calamity, every catastrophe which has befallen Klal Yisrael, and that day is Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is not just about the destruction of Beis HaMikdash. Tisha B'Av is not just about the destruction of a structure. Tisha B'Av ultimately, again, is a day that is all about the destruction and the loss of anything and everything that we have endured over the last thousands of years. So the Gemara is saying, how can you go to work? How does a person go to work in the midst of that? Does anyone say during Shiva, you know what, I really loved my father a lot, but you know what? Got a meeting, got to prepare. I love my mother so much, but you know what? There's a client. What could I do? No one would ever, chas v'shalom, ever fathom that. So Tisha B'Av al achas kama v'kama is the compounded loss of Klal Yisrael over the millennia. Person can't work. Person can't. Obviously, if sometimes in life a person has no choice, okay, I try to minimize. But if a person has any level of control, it's worth it. I know people sometimes have a limited amount of time off from their employer. It's a good investment. It's a good investment to use the day off, ultimately, for Tisha B'Av. So the Gemara goes right to Tanya Idam Shmuel Omer Kol Ochal V'Shoseh B'Tes B'Av Kilo Ochal V'Shoseh Yom Kippurim. A person who eats and drinks on Tisha B'Av is like a person who eats and drinks on Yom Kippur. Such a strong lashon. And I will say one more. Rabbi Kiva Omer Kol Oseh Melacha B'Tisha B'Av Eino Roeh Simin Bracha Li'olam. I will say, what a strong Gemara. A person who works on Tisha B'Av does not see bracha, does not see any level of blessing from that work forever. Now, I will say, the lashon over here is strange. It's very strange. What does it mean? I understand. Just say, if a person works on Tisha B'Av, what does it sound like? The Gemara is saying? What does it sound like? If you go to work on Tisha B'Av and you work on Tisha B'Av, what's going to happen? You're not going to benefit from that work. So why do you have the word li'olam in there? Why li'olam? The both say, look at a scary Tosus. Tosus, top of Lamed Amud Beis. Kala osa malacha b'tishav ein hara siman bracha li'olam. Kilomar, ba'osa malacha sheragil lazos b'tishav eina roa siman bracha li'olam. What the Gemara saying, says Tosus, is any type of work you do, a person does on Tisha B'Av, a person is never going to see bracha from that category of work forever. Forever. So it's which is a chilling Gemara. So it's not just the pshat that I'm not going to see bracha from work I do on Tisha B'Av. What it means is I'm not going to see bracha from that category, from that type of work forever. Forever, the olam. Rabbi said, why so severe? Why so severe? Why so severe? So here we go. So the Gemara says, Chamram kol osam malach b'tes ba'enos ba'enos. Here we go. Chamram kol osam malach b'tes ba'av. Ve'eno misabel. We'll just go a few more minutes. Ve'eno misabel al Yerushalayim eino roeh b'simchasa. Ultimately, again, why Rabbi said? Because the Chachamim say, if a person is working on Tisha B'Av, if I'm working, by definition, what am I not doing? What am I not doing? I'm not mourning. I'm not mourning. If I'm working, then I'm not mourning. And therefore, again, kala osa malacha b'tes ba'av ve'eno mis'abel al Yerushalayim. If I'm working on Tisha B'Av and I'm not mourning for Yerushalayim, eino roeh b'simchasa. Then I will not merit to see in the joy of a rebuilt Yerushalayim. Shene'amar simchu es Yerushalayim v'gilu ba kol ohaveha. Because the pasuk says over here, pasuk according to Yeshayahu, simcha es Yerushalayim v'gilu ba, rejoice in Yerushalayim, rejoice with it, kol ohaveha, all who love her, sisu ita masos kol hamisablim aleha. So I will say, what do you see from here? You see a connection between those who mourn for Yerushalayim and those who rejoice for Yerushalayim. And Mikan Amru, Rabbi say, this is such an incredibly important line. Kol hamisabel al Yerushalayim zocha v'roeh b'simchasa. Whoever mourns for Yerushalayim, ultimately again will be privileged to see. Zocha will be privileged, v'roeh to see b'simchasa, in the joy, in the rebuilding of Yerushalayim. V'she'eno mis'abel al Yerushalayim, but whoever does not mourn from Yerushalayim, eino roeh b'simchasa, will not merit to see the simcha of the rebuilding of Yerushalayim. So Rabbi say, what a powerful Gemara. So the Gemara is saying over here, if a person works on Tisha B'Av, it means that by definition, if I'm working, then I'm not mourning for Yerushalayim. And if I'm not mourning for Yerushalayim, then at the end of the day, I will not be privileged to be able to go ahead and see its rebuilding, to ultimately see its restoration, to see the Geula. And therefore, again, the Gemara comes out so strong. There's a whole bunch of the rest of the year you could work. You'll work harder on Erev Tisha B'Av, and you'll work harder on the 10th of Av. But on Tisha B'Av, a Yid has to mourn. On Tisha B'Av, a Yid has to feel that which has been lost, because only those who participate in the sadness in the morning will be Zoche Mirza Hashem to participate and to see the rebuilding. And I will say, I tell you something amazing. The Chassam Sofer asks such a profound question. He says the wording of the Lashon over here doesn't make sense, right? It says, Kala mis'abel al Yerushalayim Zoche v'roeh b'simchasa. Whoever mourns Yerushalayim, Zocha, privileged, V'roeh, sees the Simcha. Chassam Sofer says, how should the Gemara have been written? How should it be written? Kol mis'abel al Yerushalayim. If you mourn for Yerushalayim, then what? Yizke v'yir'eh b'simchasa. Right? In other words, it should be future tense. If I mourn for Yerushalayim, he says, Dahavi leil meimar, Yizke v'yir'eh lashon asid. Lashon asid. It should be the future. If I mourn for Yerushalayim, then I will be privileged to see the rebuilding of Yerushalayim. And the Chassam Sofer says something absolutely amazing. He quotes actually from these parashios. It says by Yaakov Avinu, right? When Yaakov thought that Yosef was dead. So what does the pasuk say? Vayima'en lehisnachem. He could not be consoled. Remember what Rashi HaKadosh says on the pasuk? Why vayima'en lehisnachem? Why not? Why couldn't he be consoled? Rashi says, Mekan de'in mekablin tanchumin alachai. Why couldn't Yaakov be consoled? Because Yosef wasn't dead. because Yosef was alive. You see, you cannot be consoled for something that is alive. So in other words, Kadosh Baruch Hu programmed the universe in a way that when we encounter loss, when something's dead and gone, there is an innate coping mechanism that is there that allows us ultimately to move on. It takes time, but there's the ability to move on. But when something's not dead and gone, it's impossible to move on. Yaakov Avinu couldn't move on. It wasn't a chisron in Yaakov, because Yosef wasn't dead. There was a part of him, that mechanism that allows me to move past loss and rebuild. It wasn't triggered in Yaakov because Yosef was alive. Says the Chassam Sofer. So listen to these words. When I mourn over the Beis Hamikdash, when you mourn for something, when you feel perpetual pain for something, that's why do you feel perpetual pain over something? Because it's still alive. Because it's still there. You see, things that are dead and gone, we move past. But things that are still alive, things that are still in existence, ultimately again, you feel perpetual pain over it. So says the Chassam Sofer, if I mourn over the Beis Hamikdash and I feel pain over the Beis Hamikdash, and Bible say, when we speak about, see, this is so incredibly important, when we speak about the loss of the Beis Hamikdash, what is it that we're mourning? We're not mourning a structure, right? I mean, we're partially mourning a structure, but we're mourning everything that the loss of a Beis Hamikdash represents. A Beis Hamikdash brought universal equilibrium. A Beis Hamikdash kept the Shekhinah down in this world. And when there is no Beis Hamikdash, the universe is not as it should be. That's what I mourn. And when you could mourn for something, that means that there's a piece of it that's alive inside of you. Because at the end of the day, if it was dead and buried, dead and gone, we move past things like that. But things that cause us perpetual pain, things that cause us perpetual angst, that's like Yaakov Avinu. He couldn't stop mourning for his son. Why not? Because his son was alive. His son was alive. When I constantly mourn for the Beis Hamikdash, and there's a piece of me that's constantly unsettled, that's because the Beis Hamikdash is alive in me. The Beis Hamikdash is alive in me. The Belvavi Mishkan Evne. It's not gone. It's not gone. It's inside of me, just yearning to come out. It's inside of me, yearning to be rebuilt. When you mourn for the Beis Hamikdash, it's not Yiske. It's not Yiske v'yer b'simchasa. It's Zochav b'simchasa. Why says the Chassam Sofer? Because the fact that I still mourn for a Beis Hamikdash, the fact that it's not dead and buried, dead and gone, indicates that what? It's still here with me. And if it's still here with me, Zocha v'roa b'simchasa. It's not future. There's a quasi-nechama. There's a quasi-rebuilding of the Beis Hamikdash that occurs while I'm mourning for it. Because we only mourn for things that are still somewhat alive within us. Once it's dead, once it's gone, we simply move on. I will say, you hear the godless of this? So that's why it's so important to mourn, because when you mourn for the Beis Hamikdash, and it's an incredible anomaly. When I mourn for it, it's because it's still alive inside of me. So the mourning is in and of itself indicative. Zocha v'roa b'simcha. So, we had the incredible privilege. The first night of Hanukkah, we're by the Kotel. They kindled the menorah right by the Kotel Plaza. So we were there the first night, and it was. I have to tell you, it was that night. Actually, it's very moving. They invite widows and orphans of soldiers from the IDF. Those are the ones who are invited for the first halakas. You have to say it's a very overwhelming sight, because you see these families who suffered such loss, and they're kindling the menorah, the first light, right by the last remaining vestige of the Beis Hamikdash. And, on one hand, you look around, and there's so many things that are broken. You see widows who are broken. You see children who are broken. You see a Beis Hamikdash that's broken. And then you see a menorah that's kindled. And in that one little space, everything's broken, and everything's whole. at the same time. Everything is so sad, and yet everything is so besimcha. All at the same time. Incredible. It's an overwhelming, and it doesn't make sense. Like, as I say it, like, the words don't make sense. How could something be broken? How could something be whole at the same time? But the truth is, the Jew understands actually how something could be broken and can be broken and whole at the same. It's possible. It's possible for something to be utterly broken and to be completely whole exactly at the same moment. Isn't that the dialectic of Klal Yisrael? We're broken and we're whole. We're mourning and we're besimcha. I'm mourning a Beis HaMikdash, but the fact that I'm mourning, it indicates to me that it's inside of me. We give up sometimes, again, the best of Klal Yisrael, our best young men who fall defending the state, defending Am Yisrael, defending Eretz Yisrael. But yet again, b'damai chayi, only through that sacrifice do we live. You know, it was amazing at the at this first hadlaka. They had the defense minister. Gans was there, and it was so interesting. You know, so the chief rabbi is there, Gans is there, a whole bunch of other people, and it's incredible because it was a moment of like Am Yisrael, all different kinds of people, all different kinds of backgrounds, broken, whole, everything coming together. It says the Chasam Sofer, that's what it means. Kala misabel al Yerushalayim. It's not future tense. It's not if you mourn, you will see the Geula. It's if you mourn, you are experiencing the Geula in that moment. Because if you mourn for it, that means it's alive inside of you. And it's if alive inside of you, then it's only a matter of time till the complete vision of Geula actualizes. And now you see why Chazal are so stark in their don't go to work on Tisha B'Av speech. Right? Come on, this is the biggest problem. Klal Yisrael, people working on Tisha B'Av, this is the biggest problem? No, it's not the biggest problem. But don't you want the Beis HaMikdash to be alive inside of you? Don't you want to have that feeling that there's something alive inside of me that is yearning to come out? There's something alive inside of me that wants to be actualized. I want my Beis HaMikdash back. And when we mourn, and this is the incredible dialectic, when we mourn for that which has been lost, in fact, it is the greatest testament to that which is alive and that which is actively being rebuilt. Not rebuilt in the future, but being rebuilt in that moment. Let's just finish the two dots. Taina Hakir Bryce that supports this. Kala ochel basar v'shosai b'tes ba'av. Whoever eats meat and drinks wine on Tisha B'Av. Alav Akasav Omer about this individual. The pasuk says, "Vatihi avonosam alatzmosam." Ultimately, again, quotes over here the pasuk. That ultimately, again, vatiyavonosam alatzmosam, which literally means their iniquity will be on their bones. Right? So we'll stop over here for today. We're going to say tomorrow, B'Sha'a Tova U'Mitzlachas, the last daf of Maseches Taanis. Incredible simcha, incredible accomplishment. Wishing everyone a wonderful day. Shkayach, everyone.